Most people think INFJs are born wise, empathetic, and intuitive, but few understand the origin of those traits. Behind the calm eyes and gentle spirit lies a childhood that was anything but simple. A childhood shaped by emotional intensity, silent burdens, hidden fears, and a depth of perception far beyond their years. In this video, we're looking into the shocking, rarely discussed childhood experiences that forge the INFJ personality. If you're an INFJ, this may explain why you've always felt different. Let's begin. If you want to truly understand yourself and unlock your full potential as an INFJ, check out the INFJ Purpose Compass today. The link is in the description of this video. Many INFJs grow into the adults they become because of the strange, intense, and often shocking inner world they lived through as children. Long before they can name their intuition or understand why they feel different, INFJ children move through the world with an unusual emotional radar that picks up everything. Spoken words, hidden motives, the pain people pretend not to feel, and even the emotions adults think they've concealed. While other children are simply learning to tie their shoes or memorize multiplication tables, the INFJ child is deciphering the emotional climate of every room they enter. This early sensitivity often becomes both their gift and their wound. It's shocking, in hindsight, how early they begin carrying burdens that don't belong to them. They become the quiet child who knows when someone is lying, the small observer who senses tension at home long before it erupts, the young emotional sponge absorbing the distress of parents, siblings, teachers, and peers. They rarely speak about what they notice because they assume, mistakenly, that everyone else sees and feels the same things. When they eventually realize they're the only ones sensing these deeper layers, the loneliness starts to sink in. INFJ children often experience a disorienting contradiction. They are wise beyond their years, yet emotionally unprotected. Their insight develops early, but their ability to shield themselves from emotional overwhelm comes much later. This imbalance frequently places them in environments where adults unknowingly rely on them for emotional support. Some INFJs become the confidant of a stressed parent, the mediator between fighting family members, or the understanding child teachers turn to when they can't handle more chaos. The shocking part is not simply that a child can do these things, but that the adults around them may come to expect it. Many INFJs grow up feeling more like the caretaker than the one being cared for, internalizing the idea that their needs must shrink to make space for the needs of others. This early emotional labor shapes their later empathy and wisdom, but not without cost. It teaches them to carry too much and speak too little. It hardens their sense of responsibility, even while softening their heart. In many INFJ childhoods, there is a sense of invisibility that cuts surprisingly deep. Because they are quiet, thoughtful, and compliant, they are often overlooked, not out of malice, but because their inner world is so rich and self-contained that adults assume they are fine. However, inside, the INFJ child is often grappling with a storm of intuition, questions, and emotional impressions that they cannot articulate. While other children cry or rebel when hurt, an INFJ may retreat into silence, trying to understand the meaning behind the hurt instead of expressing it. This silence becomes their shield, but also their prison. The surprising part is how often their pain goes unnoticed simply because they don't externalize it. The INFJ learns early that their emotional experiences exist in a space no one else can access unless they are invited in. And invitations are rare, because rejection of their inner world feels like rejection of their entire being. Many INFJs experience childhood as a series of moments where they feel different from their peers. They may be the child who prefers deep conversations over games, the one who befriends adults more easily than children, the one who overthinks interactions long after they've ended. They sense the hidden dynamics in social groups, and sometimes feel the hurt of others more intensely than their own. This heightened perception can be confusing, even frightening, when they are too young to understand that their intuition is a gift rather than a strange flaw. They may feel alienated, as if they were dropped into the world with a manual no one else received. This quiet alienation often follows them for years, shaping their later longing for relationships that feel authentic, profound, and safe. For many INFJs, the shocking truth of childhood lies in how early they learn to mask. They sense that their depth makes others uncomfortable, so they dilute it. They sense that their insights may be too much, so they silence them. They sense that their emotional intensity could overwhelm others, so they soften themselves to avoid being misunderstood or rejected. This early self-editing becomes second nature, and in adulthood, it often evolves into chronic self-suppression. Beneath their composed exterior, however, lies a child who once felt everything too deeply and learned too soon that sensitivity could be dangerous. Even when INFJs grow up in peaceful households, they often carry an emotional inheritance that feels heavier than their environment suggests. Their intuition magnifies every subtle disharmony. Their empathy turns them into lightning rods for sadness and tension. Even small disruptions, changes in tone, strained smiles, unspoken disappointment, can leave a lasting mark. Many INFJs later describe their childhoods not as outwardly traumatic, but as internally overwhelming. They lived in a world where every feeling felt amplified, every unspoken tension felt urgent, and every emotional inconsistency felt like something they needed to decode. This internal intensity becomes the foundation for the deep emotional intelligence they develop. But it is also the source of the exhaustion and quiet sadness many INFJs carry into adulthood. INFJs grow up feeling like observers rather than participants, healers rather than children, empaths in a world that doesn't know how to handle empathy. Their childhood is the origin story of their intuition, their insight, their compassion, but also their self-doubt, their emotional fatigue, and their lifelong fear of being misunderstood. It is a childhood marked by quiet resilience, invisible burdens, and an inner world far more mature than their age should allow. During childhood, many INFJs begin forming an inner sanctuary that becomes both their refuge and their secret world. Because they struggle to find external environments that feel emotionally safe or intellectually stimulating, they retreat inward, creating vivid mental landscapes filled with symbolism, imagined conversations, and scenarios that help them process their feelings. This internal world becomes shockingly advanced at a young age. While other children are lost in simple fantasies, INFJs build entire emotional ecosystems, quiet places where they can test their thoughts, analyze interactions, and soothe themselves when the external world feels too loud or too shallow. Adults often mistake this rich inner life for shyness or detachment, not realizing that the INFJ child is simply trying to make sense of everything they are absorbing. This inner sanctuary later becomes the foundation of their creativity, intuition, and empathy, but in childhood it often functions as an emotional survival mechanism. Another surprising element of the INFJ childhood is the sense of responsibility they develop long before they understand the concept. Many INFJs grow up feeling as though they must hold the emotional fabric of their environment together. They become protectors, silently taking on the role of stabilizing the mood in the home, comforting siblings, or anticipating conflict before it erupts. Even in calm households, INFJs often feel compelled to be the one who adapts, the one who understands, the one who eases tension without being asked. This premature emotional maturity can be shocking because it pushes them into roles they are not developmentally ready for. It shapes them into adults who instinctively try to fix everything and everyone, even when it drains them to the bone. The truth is that many INFJs were never taught how to simply be children. They were taught, implicitly or explicitly, to be emotional caretakers. There is also a subtle but powerful identity conflict that many INFJs face during childhood. They are born with a strong intuitive compass and a natural inclination toward authenticity, but they quickly learn that the world values conformity more than truth. In school, they may feel pressure to fit into rigid social structures that make no sense to them. They sense the unspoken rules of group dynamics and try to follow them, but doing so feels unnatural, even painful. Many INFJs learn to camouflage their depth, humor, intelligence, or emotional insight because standing out feels risky. This inner tug-of-war between wanting to belong and refusing to betray their authentic nature creates a quiet identity fracture. By the time they reach adolescence, many INFJs feel as though they are living two parallel lives. the external self that blends in, and the internal self that remains hidden, waiting for someone safe enough to see it. The emotional intensity of INFJ childhoods also creates early existential awareness. While their peers are focused on play and exploration, INFJs are often thinking about meaning, purpose, connection, and the deeper reasons behind people's actions. They ask questions that unsettle adults. They reflect on emotions with uncanny insight. They try to understand abstract ideas that are far beyond their years. This profound inner questioning can be both awe-inspiring and alarming, because INFJs often feel these thoughts in their bodies, not just their minds. This depth makes them appear mature, but beneath the maturity is a child overwhelmed by the enormity of their own awareness. Another often overlooked aspect of INFJ childhood is how deeply they feel unreciprocated emotional energy. When they give understanding and empathy, but receive none in return, it doesn't just disappoint them, it wounds them. As children, they rarely express this hurt. Instead, they internalize it, believing that something about them must be wrong for others to overlook their emotional needs. This creates early patterns of self-sacrifice, where they learn to love deeply but expect little in return. This imbalance follows them into adulthood, shaping their relationships, and often leading them into dynamics where they give far more than they receive, a pattern rooted not in personality, but in childhood conditioning. INFJs often become observers of human nature long before they understand their own nature. Because they study people so closely, watching facial expressions, micro-reactions, emotional shifts, they learn the patterns of others much faster than they learn their own emotional boundaries. This leads to a childhood where they understand everyone except themselves. Their intuition works flawlessly outwardly, but inwardly they may feel confused, fragmented, or misunderstood. They can explain why someone else is hurting, but cannot explain their own pain. They can comfort others effortlessly, yet struggle to articulate their own emotional needs. This inner disconnect begins quietly in childhood and becomes one of the defining internal battles of their adult life. Even as children, many INFJs begin to develop a heightened sensitivity to emotional injustice. Even before they fully understand morality or social rules, they feel an instinctive pull to defend those who are vulnerable. The pain of others hits them with a force that feels almost physical, and witnessing unfairness, whether it's a classmate being mocked, a sibling being scolded too harshly, or an adult being dismissed, stirs something fierce inside them. Yet, paradoxically, they often remain silent, observing from the sidelines because they fear drawing attention to themselves or making the situation worse. This internal conflict between their deep compassion and their reluctance to disrupt harmony becomes a defining emotional struggle. In adulthood, this same dynamic shapes their activism, their protective instincts, and their tendency to carry guilt for things that were never theirs to fix. Another hidden part of the INFJ childhood is the way they absorb and interpret nonverbal communication. They read eyes, posture, breathing patterns, the tension in a jawline, the tremor in a voice. They pick up on tiny, almost invisible indicators that others overlook. This acute sensitivity often makes them feel older than they are, because they experience emotional nuance usually reserved for adults. A simple family dinner can be an overwhelming symphony of subtle cues. Someone is irritated, someone is sad, someone is holding back words. The INFJ absorbs it all, often without anyone realizing how much they're taking in. This constant sensory emotional processing becomes exhausting, leaving them drained in ways that adults rarely understand. They're often told to stop overthinking, even though they aren't thinking. They're feeling, and they cannot turn it off. The loneliness of the INFJ childhood is not always caused by other people. Often, it comes from the INFJ's own tendency to self-isolate. When the outer world becomes too intense, too loud, or too superficial, they retreat into their inner sanctum where things make sense. They disappear into books, stories, art, imagination, or nature, not as escapism, but as a way of reconnecting with themselves. This solitude becomes a kind of emotional oxygen. Yet because they withdraw so quietly, adults rarely notice how desperately they need this time. Instead, they may be labeled distant, daydreamy, or oversensitive. The INFJ child learns to hide their need for solitude, even though it is essential to their well-being. This early suppression later evolves into the adult INFJ's complicated relationship with hermit-like tendencies, burnout, and social fatigue. One of the most surprising aspects of the INFJ childhood is how early they begin forming idealized visions of connection. They imagine friendships that feel safe, relationships that feel complete, and conversations that flow with honesty and depth. Yet they rarely, if ever, find these connections in childhood. This discrepancy between the depth they crave and the surface-level interactions available to them creates a quiet ache that follows them for years. They wonder why no one else seems interested in talking about their fears, dreams, or reflections. They wonder why other children avoid emotional honesty. Over time, they learn to expect very little from others while secretly longing for someone who sees them without needing explanation. This longing becomes one of the emotional threads that binds INFJs together across the world. In many INFJ childhoods, there is a unique and painful pattern. They are expected to understand others, but others are not expected to understand them. Adults praise them for being calm, patient, perceptive, and kind, but these same qualities become the reason their own emotional needs are ignored. People assume they are fine because they appear composed. They assume they aren't hurting because they don't express distress loudly. They assume they don't need help because they look like they have everything figured out. The INFJ child internalizes this misunderstanding and begins to believe that their role is to support, not be supported. As they grow, this belief becomes a form of emotional self-erasure, causing them to prioritize everyone else while denying their own fragility. Another overlooked but deeply impactful part of the INFJ childhood is their tendency to blame themselves for the emotional climate around them. If someone at home is angry, they wonder if they caused it. If a teacher seems disappointed, they assume it's directed at them. If friendships become strained, they analyze every detail to figure out what they did wrong. This self-blame stems from their hyper-awareness of emotional shifts combined with their difficulty separating intuition from responsibility. They feel as though they should have prevented the tension, fixed the problem, or anticipated the need. This pattern, formed so early and so subtly, becomes one of the hardest emotional habits for INFJs to unlearn in adulthood. INFJ children also tend to develop a rich sense of symbolism and metaphor long before they understand why. They interpret events not just as events, but as representations of deeper truths. A small emotional injury becomes a lesson about trust. A moment of rejection becomes a symbol of human fragility. A kind gesture becomes a sign that hope still exists. They seek meaning instinctively, weaving emotional threads into stories that help them make sense of their experiences. This symbolic thinking becomes the root of their creativity and insight, but in childhood, it often makes simple moments feel heavier and more profound than adults ever realize.